The wind had a way of telling secrets out on the high plain. It slid through the grass like a whisper that had been waiting years to be heard, brushing against fence posts, rattling the loose boards of a weathered barn, and carrying with it the dry smell of dust and sage. On that evening, just as the sun sank low and painted the land in copper and gold, a lone cowboy stood still as if the earth itself had asked him not to move. He was not a man given to hesitation, yet his boots felt rooted, his breath measured, his thoughts louder than the cicadas waking in the weeds. She stood a few steps away, close enough to hear the faint creak of his leather gloves when he shifted his hands, far enough that the space between them felt wider than the open range. The old American West had taught people to speak plain and act sure, but it had never taught them how to handle moments like this, when silence pressed harder than words ever could. The day had been long, filled with work that left the body tired and the mind restless. Now the work was done, and what remained felt heavier than any chore. They had not planned to be alone together at dusk. It had simply happened the way most true things do, quietly and without asking permission. She had come to the ranch with practical reasons, matters of land and stock, and a future that needed tending. He had agreed to help because helping was what he knew, and because something about her steady gaze made him want to do right by her. Over days of shared labor, the kind that leaves hands rough and backs sore, a different sort of closeness had taken root. It grew in the pauses between tasks, in the way their eyes met and lingered just a second longer than needed. The cowboy was known across these parts as a man who kept to himself. Folks said he had chosen the wide sky over company, the quiet of cattle over conversation. He did not argue with that because it was mostly true. Solitude had been his companion for so long that he trusted it more than people. Yet here he was, heart thudding like hooves on hard ground, feeling more exposed than he ever had beneath the open sky. She was not easily unsettled. Life on the frontier had taught her resilience, had shaped her into someone who met trouble with a straight spine and steady hands. Still, there was something about the way he looked at her now that made her chest tighten. It was not hunger or boldness. It was caution mixed with longing, a carefulness that asked permission without saying so. She had seen men who took what they wanted. This man was different, and that difference made her uneasy in a way she could not name. The light shifted, shadows stretching long and thin across the yard. Somewhere, a horse snorted softly, and the sound seemed too loud in the quiet. The cowboy cleared his throat, then stopped himself. He had said plenty of hard things in his life, words meant to settle disputes or give orders, but none of them felt as difficult as what sat on his tongue now. He had promised himself he would not speak unless he was sure. Out here, promises mattered. She watched him closely, noticing how his jaw tightened, how his eyes dropped to the ground and then lifted again to meet hers. There was patience in her stance, but also a question. She was waiting, and he knew it. The waiting felt like standing on the edge of a creek after a hard rain, knowing the water was cold and swift, but stepping forward anyway. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost rough with restraint. He did not dress the moment up with clever words or false confidence. He asked simply, "Can I kiss you?" The question hung in the air, plain and honest, with no place to hide. She did not answer right away. The question was not shocking, yet it landed with a weight she had not expected. It felt more intimate than a touch, more revealing than a hand laid gently on her arm. In that single sentence, he had shown her his intent, his respect, and his vulnerability. He had placed the choice in her hands, and that choice felt heavy. Her thoughts raced back to other times, other men, other moments when closeness had come without warning or care. This was different. The lone cowboy was not asking for permission out of fear. He was asking because it mattered to him. That realization stirred something deep inside her, something both tender and frightening. Intimacy had a way of opening doors that could not be easily closed again. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of distant cattle and the faint creak of the house behind them. Time seemed to slow, stretching the moment until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She studied his face, reading the lines earned by sun and solitude, the quiet hope in his eyes. He did not move closer, he did not reach for her. He waited. In that waiting, she saw the kind of man he was, shaped by the old American West and its unwritten rules. Strength was not in taking, but in holding back. Courage was not loud, but steady. She felt the pull of that understanding, felt her own guard waver. Yet with it came fear. A kiss could change things. It could turn shared work into shared feeling, and feeling into something harder to walk away from. Her heart beat faster, and she wondered if he could hear it. The space between them felt charged now, alive with possibilities she had not planned for. She thought of the ranch, of the future she was trying to build, of the risks she had already taken to stand where she stood. Letting him kiss her would be another risk, one that had nothing to do with land or money and everything to do with trust. He sensed her hesitation and felt a quiet ache, though he did not regret asking. Whatever her answer, he had spoken the truth, and that mattered. He reminded himself that wanting did not grant him a right. Out here, a man lived with the consequences of his choices, good or bad. He would live with this one too. She finally drew a slow breath, steadying herself. The question still echoed in her mind, simple yet profound. "Can I kiss you?" It was not the act itself that unsettled her, but what it promised and what it risked. She looked past him for a moment, toward the fading light and the endless stretch of land, as if searching for guidance in the horizon. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened, though uncertainty still lingered. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, and then she stopped. The moment balanced on a knife edge, poised between answer and silence. The cowboy waited, the wind whispered, and the old land watched, holding its secrets close as whatever came next threatened to change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet see. The silence stretched on, heavy and deliberate, like the pause between two heartbeats. She had never been one to let emotions run unchecked, and yet, in that moment, she felt the past and the present collide in ways that unsettled her. Her thoughts drifted back to the first time she had stepped foot on this land, to the cracked dirt and stubborn grass that had welcomed her with a stubborn stubbornness of its own. The ranch had not been hers yet, only in the sense that she had claimed it with determination and hard work, but it had its own history, its own stubborn hold on anyone who tried to tame it. She remembered the early mornings when the sun was just a smear of orange over the horizon and the air smelled of dust and dew. Back then, the world had seemed simpler, the challenges just chores and fences needing repair. But the land had taught her lessons she hadn't known she needed, and the people she had met along the way had left impressions she could never shake. The cowboy had arrived one morning, riding slow along the dirt road, dust curling around his boots and the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. He had not spoken much at first, he rarely did. A man of few words, his actions had always said more than any sentence could carry. Folks in town whispered about him, about the way he kept to himself and the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way he could handle horses, cattle, and danger without a single word wasted. And yet, when she had first watched him work, she had noticed the small things, the careful way he held a rope, the way he seemed to study the land with a patient eye, and the subtle pauses that suggested thoughtfulness rather than indifference. Over time, their paths had crossed more frequently. At first, it had been business. He had helped repair a fence that threatened to spill cattle onto the neighbor's property, his hands sure and steady. She had watched him work in silence, learning that he measured effort not in words but in results. Then came the long rides, side by side, sometimes with no need for conversation, letting the land and the wind speak for them. On those rides, she had begun to notice the small details, the hint of a smile when a horse obeyed without fuss, the way he shifted his weight in the saddle when approaching steep terrain, and the quiet consideration in his gaze when the horizon stretched open and endless. She thought about the town too, the gossip and the knowing looks she sometimes received. People liked to tell stories about those who lived alone or those who appeared dangerous, but she knew better than to trust whispers. The cowboy had a reputation, yes, but she had learned to separate talk from truth, and what she had discovered behind the brim of his hat and under the rugged coat was a man shaped by his choices and by the land he had roamed. A man who carried solitude like a shield, and yet, in moments like this, she saw how fragile that shield could be. The ranch itself held secrets, layers of history that had settled like dust over the years. The barn, weathered and leaning slightly, had once been the heart of a thriving homestead. Old photographs, brittle with age, hinted at lives lived and struggles faced. Stories of cattle drives and harsh winters, of feuds settled with words or with fists, were whispered in the town but often left unsaid on the land itself. The walls seemed to hum with the memories of those who had walked the property long before her, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she imagined them watching, as if the land itself demanded respect and loyalty. The cowboy had his own past, though he rarely spoke of it. Rumors suggested loss and hardship, and she had pieced together fragments from what little he had allowed to slip into conversation. He had grown up with the kind of life that forced a man to learn early what it meant to endure, to survive, and to move forward even when every step seemed uncertain. There had been family, perhaps, but absence had taught him independence. There had been roads traveled, some leading to danger, some to quiet stretches where the sky opened endlessly above him. She wondered what had brought him here, to this land, to this precise moment, standing before her with a question that had the power to shift everything. Her own life had not been without challenges. She had wrestled with choices that weighed heavily on her conscience and with dreams that had not always aligned with the world around her. She had learned to hold her ground, to measure risk, to understand that every decision had consequences that could ripple for years. And yet, for all the careful thought she had applied to her life, she found herself unprepared for the simple weight of a question. It was not the act itself that mattered, but the meaning behind it. A kiss in this moment represented trust, vulnerability, and a crossing of lines she had drawn around herself. As the sun dipped lower, the wind carried scents and sounds that heightened her awareness. Horses nickering in the distance, the soft clatter of a loose hinge somewhere near the barn, the whisper of grass under the evening breeze, all of it made the moment feel suspended in time. She shifted slightly, catching the faint glint of sunlight on the cowboy's gloves and the determined set of his shoulders. Every detail became amplified, each small gesture speaking volumes in the language of people who had learned to read actions more than words. She remembered other questions in her life, the ones that demanded answers without warning, the ones that forced a reckoning she could not avoid. And now, here was a question she had not anticipated, one that required honesty and courage in equal measure. It was simple in its words, yet complicated in its implications. "Can I kiss you?" The phrasing itself suggested care, restraint, and awareness of choice. He was asking not because he expected an answer, but because he respected her enough to seek it. That respect made the moment heavier, made the waiting longer, and made her pulse pound louder than it had for years. He did not break eye contact. He did not step closer. He simply waited, standing steady and patient as if time itself had slowed to accommodate this fragile intersection of desire and restraint. She wondered if he understood how much courage it had taken to ask, and in her heart she realized that the same courage would be required to answer. Every instinct in her screamed that what came next could change everything. And yet, every instinct also whispered caution, reminding her that trust was earned, not assumed, and that some moments, once crossed, could never be undone. The horizon darkened and stars began to prick the sky with light. Shadows from the barn stretched across the ground like fingers reaching toward them, and the first hint of night settled over the ranch. Somewhere a whippoorwill called out, its lonely song a reminder that the land had always been a place of waiting and watching. She breathed deeply, the dry air filling her lungs, grounding her even as emotions swirled like dust devils across the plain. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to show that he noticed her hesitation, and in that gesture there was an unspoken promise. He would wait. He would not force the moment. He would honor her choice, whatever it might be. That simple patience carried more weight than any action he could take, and she felt the pull of it deep in her chest. The question remained, unanswered, heavy in the space between them, and for a long moment all else fell away. She thought again of the past, of the land, of the man before her, and of herself. Every step that had led her here had prepared her in some way for this moment, though she had never known it. And yet, knowing preparation did not ease the uncertainty, did not soften the tension that had wound itself around her like barbed wire. She was aware of every heartbeat, every sound, every flicker of light in the fading day, and of how much depended on the next words or the next silence. Somewhere beyond the fields, coyotes called to each other, sharp and distant. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, of horses, of earth. It carried the history of this land and the promise of what could come. And still she stood frozen, caught in a moment that demanded courage and honesty in equal measure, caught between instinct and reason, between desire and caution. The cowboy waited, unwavering, and in that quiet endurance she recognized something rare and fragile, a respect that refused to be rushed, a patience that would honor her choice, and a depth that could not be measured by a glance or a gesture alone. The wind stirred again, lifting strands of hair across her face, and she brushed them back without breaking her gaze. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the horizon holding the last light of day like a promise, a warning and a temptation all at once. She felt the weight of what was unspoken, the tension that had built slowly over days, over rides, over shared work and quiet understanding. And as the darkness settled further over the land, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever answer she gave, whatever choice she made, it would change everything. And she was not yet ready to know what that change would be. The question hung there, still waiting, still open. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to acknowledge just how much she wanted to know the answer to if he could stay patient. If he could respect her, if the unspoken promises of the land and the sky and the moment itself could carry them forward into whatever came next. The cowboy waited, steady and silent, and she felt the pull of the unknown, the promise of connection, and the fear of what that connection might demand. And in the stillness, the story of them, of the land, and of the choices yet to be made began to unfold, fragile and unyielding all at once. The night deepened over the ranch, wrapping the land in shadows that moved like slow, deliberate fingers. The stars hung pale and scattered above, indifferent to the tension below. Yet even they seemed to witness the quiet war unfolding between two people who had never needed words to communicate, and now faced a question that could unravel years of self-restraint. The cowboy's eyes remained fixed on her, patient, steady, but there was a tautness in his jaw, a subtle shift in his stance that betrayed the undercurrent of emotion he refused to name aloud. She, in turn, felt the weight of every heartbeat, every inhalation, as though the air itself were charged with the possibility of something she had neither expected nor entirely wanted, yet could not resist. The conflict was not simple. It lay layered beneath shared labor and stolen glances, beneath the fences, barns, and pastures that held memories of other people and other lives. There was the unspoken history of both of them, each carrying wounds that had yet to fully heal. The cowboy had lived with solitude like a second skin. It was not merely habit, but a shield forged in loss and long stretches of isolation. She had learned to respect that, but now the question he had asked pulled at the very edge of that shield, daring him to lower it without ever forcing her to step over her own boundaries. And she, despite her careful nature, felt that barrier trembling. Desire and caution warred within her in a way that left her breathless and uncertain. As she considered the possibilities, she could not ignore the subplots that had begun to weave themselves around this moment. The neighboring ranch, long a source of minor disputes over water rights and grazing paths, had lately become a source of tension she could not dismiss. Word had reached her that cattle were disappearing in odd numbers, and she suspected a mix of negligence and intention on the part of the nearby ranch hands. If she was to secure the future of her property, she needed focus, yet this man before her was demanding an attention that threatened to shift everything. Could she trust herself to make decisions about the land, the herds, and the seasons if her mind was so consumed by what he had asked? He, too, carried his own conflicts, though they were less visible. His solitude had been a choice, yes, but one informed by caution, by scars he had never shared. A life spent on open ranges, moving from one town to the next, surviving harsh winters and hotter-than-hell summers, had taught him to guard his heart. Yet here he was, laying it bare in a single, simple question, knowing that it could bring closeness or rejection, intimacy or a retreat he might never recover from. The very act of asking had made him vulnerable, and he felt the weight of it pressing like the dust on the prairie. It was not just about desire, it was about trust, and he had learned that trust, once given or broken, could shift the course of a man's life entirely. She shifted, her boots crunching lightly against the dry earth. Somewhere nearby, a lantern flickered in a window of the main house, casting faint light across the yard, a reminder of the world beyond this small, intimate standoff. In the distance, a horse moved in its stall, restless, a sound that somehow heightened the quiet tension between them. Every noise felt magnified, every movement deliberate. Her mind oscillated between past experiences and present uncertainty. There were other men she had known, men who demanded or assumed, who took what they wanted without regard. This cowboy was nothing like them, and that difference made the risk feel even larger. She thought of her own family history too, of a mother who had taught her to measure actions by consequences and a father who had drilled patience into her soul. Their lessons, once considered burdens, now seemed prescient. A kiss could be a promise or a complication, and she had to choose not only for herself but for everything else she had fought to protect: her land, her future, her peace. The thought was daunting, yet it was tempered by the strange, magnetic pull she felt toward him, a pull that made the choice feel almost impossible. Meanwhile, his mind was working through a parallel set of considerations. He wondered how she saw him, how she measured him not by reputation but by deeds, by glances, by the quiet insistence he carried in every action. He thought of her strength, her independence, and how the world had taught her to rely on herself. The realization struck him that their connection, fragile as it was, demanded a kind of patience that was rare. He knew that if he moved too quickly, he could shatter the trust he sought, but if he waited too long, the moment might slip into memory without becoming reality. Beneath it all lay the undercurrent of danger, not physical but emotional and practical. The ranch and the surrounding lands held threats: weather that could turn bitter in hours, livestock that could vanish, neighbors who might see opportunity in her vigilance lapsing. And yet the most immediate tension was human, between desire and restraint, between the longing to connect and the need to respect boundaries. Each glance carried meaning, each slight shift in posture amplified by history, by context, by the invisible weight of what had come before. The night deepened further, and the wind stirred the grass, carrying whispers of past conversations and unspoken warnings. The cowboy finally allowed a small sigh to escape, a sound almost swallowed by the vastness of the land. She noticed it, a subtle acknowledgment of the struggle within him, and she felt a similar tremor of vulnerability. Their conflicts were not just personal but shared, intertwined with the responsibilities of living on the land, the ghosts of past choices, and the uncertainty of what the next day might bring. Every layer of tension fed the other, creating a pressure that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the town itself loomed in the background as an unspoken subplot. There were eyes on them, curious neighbors who might misinterpret, who might gossip, who might see the smallest movement and weave it into stories that had no basis in reality. She felt the weight of that scrutiny even in the quiet of the ranch, a reminder that choices made here did not exist in isolation. The cowboy, too, was not entirely free from the gaze of others, having been observed and judged in towns across the county. Both of them carried reputations, and both knew that crossing this line could ripple far beyond the boundaries of the yard and the barn. She shifted again, sensing the carefulness in his stance and the unspoken rules he lived by. There were no grand gestures here, no declarations. Every move, every pause, every word or lack of words was weighted with meaning. She realized that the conflict was as much internal as external. It was a war of restraint versus impulse, of heart versus mind, of past experiences coloring present choices. And the stakes were high, for this was not merely desire but a fragile negotiation of trust, vulnerability, and respect. He studied her in return, aware that she was measuring him, testing the limits of what she might risk. He respected that, though it left him restless. He knew that inaction could be its own danger, that hesitation could be misread or could allow opportunity to slip away. Yet he also knew that forcing anything would be a betrayal of everything he had hoped to achieve with this moment. The tension between them was palpable, a living thing that pulsed in the space around them, shaping their choices even as it resisted resolution. The land itself seemed to respond, the shadows of trees stretching longer, the faint scent of sage riding on the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl breaking the stillness. Each sound, each flicker of movement added layers to the suspense. The question remained unanswered, a silent challenge that neither could fully ignore. The more they lingered in that space, the more it seemed that the resolution would have to wait, that the story was far from finished, and that every choice, every thought, every glance was part of a delicate dance that could tip in any direction. She drew in another breath, slow and deliberate, trying to anchor herself in the moment. He waited, steady and patient, the weight of his presence grounding her even as uncertainty gnawed at her resolve. Every instinct screamed for caution, but every instinct also hinted at the possibility of connection, of trust, of something deeper than what words could convey. And in that tension, the subplots of land disputes, past heartbreak, the silent scrutiny of neighbors, and the legacy of solitude all intertwined, creating a complexity neither had fully anticipated. The night pressed on, and the ranch settled into its own rhythm of shadows and sounds, each contributing to the quiet storm building between them. There was no resolution yet, only anticipation, only the unspoken understanding that whatever came next would carry consequences far beyond the brief span of a kiss or the fleeting courage it took to ask for one. And as they remained in that charged silence, both aware of the delicate balance of desire and restraint, of trust and risk, the story of them, their land, and the choices yet to come continued to unfold, fragile, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. The night had grown colder, and the stars were sharp, like tiny pinpricks against the velvet sky. The ranch was quiet now, except for the occasional creak of a gate swinging in the wind or the restless shuffle of a horse in its stall. Every sound seemed amplified, echoing through the dark, carrying with it the weight of unspoken words and the tension between two people who had been careful for far too long. She could feel the cool air brush against her face, but it did little to ease the heat in her chest. Every instinct she had honed over years of hard work whispered caution, yet there was a pull toward him she could no longer deny. He shifted slightly, the leather of his boots scraping the dirt, yet he did not speak. His eyes held hers, steady and patient, but beneath that calm exterior a storm of emotion raged. He had asked a simple question, but its implications were vast. It was not just a kiss he sought, it was the fragile bridge between two lives, between isolation and connection, between restraint and surrender. Every moment he waited, every second he held back, was a test of patience, a test of whether the bond that had grown between them could withstand the pressure of desire and uncertainty. Her mind wandered, recalling the long hours they had shared under the sun, working fences, riding the range, tending the livestock. Those days had built a quiet understanding between them, a rhythm that needed no words. She remembered the way he had guided a young colt through its first faltering steps, his hands firm but gentle, his voice soft enough to calm the animal. She thought of how he had helped repair the barn after the last storm, standing shoulder to shoulder with her as they lifted beams and nailed boards, sweat dripping into dust that stuck to their skin. In those shared moments, trust had taken root. Now it hung fragilely in the air between them, waiting for the next step. The distant call of an owl broke the silence, and she shivered, partly from the cool night and partly from anticipation. Her heart beat faster, and she realized that she was holding her breath, caught in a moment that demanded honesty from both of them. She wanted to speak, to break the tension, but the words seemed inadequate, incapable of capturing the swirl of feeling inside her. And he understood that. He had always understood more than most, reading gestures, gauging hesitation, sensing unspoken truths. There were other pressures as well, the practical realities of the land pressing against their fragile bubble. The neighboring ranch had been problematic for weeks, with cattle wandering onto her property and supplies mysteriously disappearing. She had tried to manage it alone, but the challenge was growing and she knew she would need help. The cowboy's presence had been a boon in those moments, a steady hand and sharp eye that had kept trouble at bay. Yet now, the stakes had shifted. The personal tension threatened to compete with the practical, and she felt the weight of both pressing in on her. He reached down to adjust the strap of his saddle, a simple movement that somehow made her pulse jump. Every motion he made was deliberate, measured, yet it carried a quiet energy that spoke of readiness and restraint at once. She studied his profile, the way the firelight from the lantern inside the barn flickered against the lines of his face. There was something raw and honest about him, something that had been hidden beneath years of solitude and caution. That honesty was magnetic, impossible to ignore, and terrifying in its intensity. She took a small step closer, then stopped, unsure whether to continue. The space between them was filled with unspoken possibilities, each one heavier than the last. She wanted to close the distance, to let go of her careful caution, but fear rooted her in place. She had survived hardship, navigated betrayal, and faced loss. Yet this moment held a different kind of danger, the kind that could undo the careful balance she had maintained for so long. And yet, her desire to trust, to lean into something real and alive, pressed against that fear with equal force. He noticed her hesitation, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flickered with uncertainty. He had learned long ago that patience was a form of strength, that forcing an outcome could destroy more than it created. And so he waited, standing firm, his own heartbeat echoing the rhythm of hers, silently willing her to make a choice. But waiting was no small thing. Each second carried weight, each pause a test of will. His mind raced, anticipating what might come next, imagining 100 scenarios in which they either moved closer or drifted apart. The wind picked up, rustling the grass and carrying the scent of sage and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry haunting and lonely. It reminded her of the vastness of the land, of the isolation they had both known, and of the risks inherent in connection. She had always prided herself on her independence, on the ability to face life's challenges without relying on anyone else. And yet, here was a man who had proven himself trustworthy, patient, capable, and yet still uncertain, still asking for something intangible and fragile. The tension was unbearable, every fiber of her being stretched tight as she contemplated what it would mean to say yes or to say no. The barn door creaked again, a subtle sound that reminded them both of the world beyond this private moment. Responsibilities waited, cattle needed tending, fences required mending. But the urgency of the land seemed secondary to the urgency of the heart, the silent conversation taking place in glances and breaths. She thought of the long days, the setting sun, the evenings spent in quiet work and quiet understanding. Those moments had built a foundation, and now the question he had asked hovered over that foundation like a storm cloud, heavy and inevitable. He stepped just slightly closer, careful not to overstep, and she felt the air between them thicken. Her pulse raced, and for the first time she noticed the faint tremor in her hands. Not from fear of him, but from the intensity of the moment, the realization that something delicate and precious hung in the balance. Every instinct screamed that they were at a turning point, that the next moment would define what came after. She could feel it in the steady pull of his gaze, the subtle tension in his stance, the patience that had been hard-earned through years of solitude. Thoughts of the neighboring ranch, the missing cattle, and the practical matters of the land flitted through her mind, yet they felt distant, almost irrelevant. The immediate tension between them eclipsed all else, demanding attention, demanding honesty, demanding a leap into the unknown. She realized that whatever happened next would not just affect her feelings or his, but the way they approached every challenge ahead, the way they faced the world together or apart. He cleared his throat softly, a gentle sound that made her start slightly, and she realized how attuned she had become to him, to the subtleties of his presence. Every movement, every sound, every breath seemed magnified, charged with the weight of the moment. The night held them suspended, a delicate balance of longing and restraint, of desire and caution, of the past and the possibility of something new. A sudden rustle of movement beyond the fence made them both glance toward the darkened edge of the pasture. A horse pawed the ground impatiently, and in that small, ordinary sound the tension cracked and reformed, a reminder that the world outside their private moment continued to turn. The interruption only heightened the suspense, emphasizing the fragility of the space between them, and making it clear that time was not infinite. She stepped closer again, her boots brushing the dry grass, and he did not move back. The air between them was electric, a tangible force that pulled and pushed, inviting and warning, testing their courage and patience alike. She wondered if he could sense her conflict, if he could feel the swirl of hesitation, desire, and fear that churned in her chest. And he, in turn, wondered if she would finally let herself trust. If she would finally allow the moment to unfold, if she would meet his courage with her own. The night deepened still further, and the ranch settled into a rhythm of shadows and whispers. The distant town lights glimmered faintly on the horizon, a reminder of a world that existed beyond this small patch of land, beyond the tension, beyond the longing. Yet for now, all that mattered was the delicate balance between them, the question hanging unanswered, the shared history and unspoken understanding building toward a moment that felt inevitable. And in that charged silence, she realized that the climax was near, that every shared glance, every pause, every step taken or withheld had led to this point. The land, the history, the responsibilities, the risks, the longing, all of it converged in a single, fragile, electric moment. The story was poised on the edge of change, the air thick with anticipation, the hearts of both of them beating in tense rhythm as they hovered between choice and surrender, between fear and the first hint of something beautiful yet unknown. The wind stirred again, lifting stray strands of her hair across her face, and he reached out slowly, deliberately, just enough to brush a finger against her arm, a touch so light it was almost imagined. The moment held them both captive, the tension stretching impossibly tight. Every instinct screamed forward, every memory whispered restraint, and the night waited with them, patient and infinite, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The night seemed to hold its breath for a moment longer, as if even the stars were waiting to see what would happen next. Her pulse slowed just slightly as she let herself acknowledge the courage it had taken to arrive here, to face the question that had hung between them like a fragile thread. The cowboy's hand remained close, hovering near her arm, not pressing, not forcing, just offering presence and reassurance. In that silent offering she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a trust that had grown steadily over days, weeks, and shared hardships finally finding a place to land. She shifted closer, and this time he did not hesitate. His hand brushed against hers, light and deliberate, carrying the weight of patience and intention. The tension that had been taut between them for so long softened just enough for her to let herself breathe fully. She realized in that instant that the barriers they had built around themselves, his solitude, her caution, were not walls meant to keep each other out, but protections waiting to be lowered when trust was proven. And now, after countless small gestures, quiet moments, and shared labors under the relentless sun, that trust had been earned. He leaned in slowly, giving her the space to respond, to pull back, to choose. She met his eyes and saw the same blend of desire and restraint that had drawn her to him in the first place. The land around them was quiet, the only sounds the soft shuffle of animals settling for the night and the whisper of wind through the grass. Time seemed to stretch, allowing them both to linger in the anticipation of connection without fear of being rushed. Then, with a gentle exhale, she closed the final distance, allowing his lips to meet hers. It was brief at first, a promise more than a declaration, yet in that small, deliberate touch lay the culmination of weeks of unspoken understanding, of mutual respect, of growing affection. The kiss lingered, not in urgency but in quiet intimacy, a careful exploration of a bond that had been building steadily. She felt the strength of his hands at her sides, steady and grounding, and realized that the man she had come to rely on, the man who had earned her trust through patience and action, was no longer just a figure on the ranch, but someone who would walk beside her through the challenges yet to come. When they finally parted, even slightly, their foreheads resting together for a moment, the world seemed both larger and smaller, vast with possibility, yet intimate with shared understanding. The practical matters of the ranch waited, but they no longer felt urgent. The missing cattle, the disputes over grazing rights, and the harsh demands of the land were still real, but the tension they had carried no longer weighed on her alone. He would stand beside her, just as she would support him. Together, they had learned that partnership was not about sharing only easy moments, but facing challenges and uncertainty together, carrying the load with steady hands and patient hearts. As they stepped back from the barn, the faint glow of lanterns inside illuminating the yard, she felt a sense of clarity she had not known before. The neighboring ranch would still be a challenge, the fences would still need mending, and storms would still test their patience. But the knowledge that they could face it together made every worry feel manageable. The small victories and daily labors that had once seemed endless and solitary now held new meaning. Work would be shared, decisions would be discussed, and even the toughest days would be softened by the companionship that had been quietly growing all along. He spoke then, his voice low and steady, as if speaking would make the night more real. "We'll handle it. All of it. Together." There was no arrogance, no false bravado, just the honesty that had drawn her in from the first day he had arrived. She nodded, feeling a smile tug at her lips despite the long hours and lingering challenges ahead. The relief was not just in the words, but in the confirmation that they had crossed the threshold from longing and uncertainty to trust and partnership. They walked slowly toward the house, their hands brushing occasionally, each contact a reaffirmation of what had been shared and what lay ahead. She thought of the land, the fields, the barns, the fences, and realized that this place, which had demanded so much from her, would now hold new joys and new meaning. The ranch would continue to test them as it always had, but it would also be a place where they could grow together, where shared victories would feel richer, and where evenings like this filled with quiet understanding and tender connection would become part of the rhythm of life. Inside the house, the lanterns cast a warm, golden light over the wooden floors and the simple furniture that had been there for decades. The scent of fresh bread, baked earlier in the day, mingled with the earthy aroma of the land that seeped through open windows. She felt a sense of peace, a rare and welcome calm after months of tension, uncertainty, and isolation. The cowboy set his hat on the rack and let out a contented sigh, a sound she had come to recognize as relief, as ease, as a quiet acknowledgement that they had arrived at a moment worth cherishing. The night was still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax fully. Their shared work and shared struggles had created a foundation that was steady and strong, a foundation upon which new memories could be built. The minor disputes with neighbors, the occasional worry about cattle or weather, even the lingering echoes of past hardships, all of it could now be faced with the support of someone who had proven himself reliable, compassionate, and capable. In the soft glow of the lanterns and the quiet hum of the night, she realized that the true reward of their connection was not a single act, but the promise of shared life, shared challenges, and shared triumphs. He moved closer once more, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo through the stillness of the house and out into the quiet fields. "It's been a long road," she said, her voice steady but warm. "And it's far from over." "Then we'll keep walking it," he replied. Step by step, together, the words were simple, but they carried the weight of promise, of hope, and of mutual understanding. It was not a declaration of perfection, but a recognition that life, work, and love were all about partnership, patience, and courage. The conflicts and challenges would not vanish overnight, but facing them together made each obstacle feel less daunting. They spent the rest of the evening preparing for the next day, sharing tasks in a rhythm that felt natural and unforced. Even small acts, checking the barn, making sure the horses had fresh water, tending to the last repairs on a fence were transformed by their cooperation, their mutual respect, and the intimacy that had quietly grown between them. The work itself became a celebration of partnership, proof that trust, patience, and understanding could turn even the most mundane chores into something meaningful. Later, as they stepped outside once more, the sky was still clear, stars reflected in her eyes like tiny fires. The ranch stretched before them, a vast expanse of land that had tested her courage, challenged her independence, and demanded resilience. Yet now it also offered connection, companionship, and the quiet joy of shared purpose. She realized that the question he had asked under the fading light had been more than a question. It had been an invitation, a turning point, and a symbol of trust that would shape the days and years to come. They lingered for a moment longer, side by side, letting the night envelop them, listening to the soft sounds of life continuing around them. In that stillness, she understood the lesson of the land, the lesson of patience, and the lesson of courage. That trust must be earned, that connection requires care, and that love, like the ranch itself, grows strongest when nurtured with patience, respect, and honesty. Finally, she leaned into him, letting her head rest against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. There was no rush, no urgency, only the quiet fulfillment of a long-awaited balance between longing and restraint, desire and patience, fear and trust. They had crossed the threshold together, and though life would continue to test them, they had found in each other a steady hand, a listening heart, and a partnership that promised more than fleeting comfort. It promised a life built together, resilient and enduring. And as the first light of dawn began to brush the horizon with soft gold, the ranch seemed to exhale along with them, carrying away the tension of the past and welcoming the possibilities of the future. They stood there for a long while, side by side, hearts still quickened but steady in the knowledge that the most difficult questions had been met, the deepest fears acknowledged, and the quiet hope of lasting companionship realized. In that gentle, unspoken understanding, the story reached its happy ending, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty that love, trust, and patience had finally found their place on the land and in each other.